Stevens. I am 10 years old and I'm a literature enthusiast.
Hi, I'm Ellie Emslie Stevens. I have a PhD in Italian. My focus is on the use of the Bible in Italian medieval literature. And most recently, I've taught at Pepperdine University as an adjunct. Today, we are going to talk about Canto 12 of Dante's Paradiso. Ruth, why don't you get us started?
Okay. As soon as the blessed flame finished speaking the last word, the holy millstone began to turn, and it had not yet completed the circle before another enclosed it and took motion from its motion and song from its song that in those sweet pipes surpass our muses, our sirens, as much as the first shining surpass its reflection. As through a tenuous cloud, two arcs curve parallel and colored alike, when Juno commands her handmaid, the outer one from the inner one, like the speech of that desirous nymph whom love consumed as the sun does vapors, and caused people here to predict the weather. Thanks to the pact God made with Noah, that the world will never again be flooded. So the two garlands of those sempiternal roses turned about us, and the outer replied to the inner one. I have a question. Is there a stack of similes in this passage? I'm hearing Greek mythology, Bible references, and music and rainbows all at the same time. It's like a metaphor lasagna.
Yes, it is, my dear. You're right. Dante would have been the best at making metaphor lasagna, as you call it, layering stack upon stack of literal, figurative, moral, and even eschatological senses. What you just read in Canto 12, in the literal sense, now we have to distinguish here. This is the literal sense within the fiction. In this sense, Beatrice and Dante are rising upward through concentric cosmic circles of Paradiso. When they began their journey, they started out going through the circles of the moon and then Mercury and then Venus, and now they're in the circles of the sun. It's also very important to make a distinction between the perspective from Dante the Pilgrim and from Dante the Poet. If we were to look at this passage from the perspective of Dante the Poet, we would need to consider that often Beatrice is considered an allegory of theology. Also, from the perspective of Dante the Poet, the circles in paradise aren't literal at all, but rather they're an allegory of angelic hierarchy. But those two are more of the poetic allegory, and those aren't cooked directly into what we're going to discuss today, which is the figurative theological allegory lasagna, though those would have been part of the overall meal, if you will, of the Divine Comedy.
Wait, Mom, you said that this is a literal sense. Does this mean that it's nonfiction?
Great question, Ruth. The famous scholar Charles Singleton put it best, I believe, when he said, quote, that the fiction of the Divine Comedy is that it's nonfiction.
Wait, so we have to make believe that it's true?
Essentially, yes. That's what Dante wants. If it helps, try to remember that this is from the perspective of Dante the Pilgrim. So try to get into his mind. And from the perspective of the pilgrim, he's traveling through these concentric circles with Beatrice. So it's the literal reality from his perspective.
What about all the rest? My brain is still chewing on a mush of different senses.
Fair enough. Next, we must look at this passage as the pilgrim describes it. Dante describes the circles from his perspective to look like a holy millstone. Do you know what a millstone is?
Yeah, it's those two circular stones that are stacked on top of each other with a hole in the middle so that the flour can be ground through. That's what they did in the old-fashioned days. And there's usually two poor donkeys pulling it around and around and around.
That's right. And this is the metaphor that Dante uses to describe the rotating spheres around him, although he doesn't mention any donkeys in his picture.
Does he imagine that he's getting ground into fine flour?
You know, I never thought about that before, but that there is a refining process happening would seem to fit with this overall picture of him ascending into a more purified and more rarefied space. I think you might have yourself a research topic. Nonetheless, this is your first metaphor, the first layer, so to speak, of this metaphor lasagna. Nonetheless, we've hardly even had time to process this idea of the millstone when right away Dante imposes upon it an allusion to pagan mythology, in particular to Narcissus and Echo. Do you remember their story from Ovid's Metamorphoses?
When Narcissus rejects Echo and falls in love with his own reflection. I think there's a Barbie movie kind of like that.
Perhaps. Ovid's stories, like Dante's, have been widely reproduced in all kinds of media. Back to Echo and Narcissus, this allusion to the Metamorphoses describes the way in which the last circle is giving way to this new one. So again, we have the image of the millstone and these two circles, and now Dante is giving us this pagan allusion to Narcissus and Echo, and the voice being on the inner and the echo being on the outer. And it's, quote, nascendo di qual dientro qual di fuori. The outer is born from the inner. Like in the way an echo on the outer would be born from voice on the inner. And this isn't all. As soon as we take a step back and look at the actual literary canticle of Paradiso, we realize that this is also an allegorical figure to describe the way in which this new canto, Canto 12, is being issued or born from the last one, Canto 11. So you have this millstone turning, and you have these two cycles, and you have voice on the inside and echo on the outside, and Canto 12 coming through from Canto 11 as an echo. And not only are these two canti figured here in an analogy as voices to echo, but Dante makes it even richer. He adds another layer, and he also describes them as reflections of each other, in particular as a rainbow that we see reflected across this refractive moisture of a thin cloud. In the Italian, he says, come si volgan per tenera nube due archi paralleli e con colori, nascendo di qual dientro qual di fuori.
So, how do the rainbows and echoes fit together?
Well, one commentator used a synesthesia to describe it. Hermann Olsner, many years ago, said of this passage that, quote, the second rainbow is like the echo of the outer rainbow.
Wow, an echo is a rainbow. What about Noah?
Yes, and then there's Noah on top of all of this. Dante's passage wouldn't be Dantean without a biblical allusion. The next reference he makes is to Noah. And authors so thoroughly steeped in the scripture wouldn't make a reference to the rainbow without remembering God's covenant promise. Per lo patto che Dio con Noè posè in verse 17. But this isn't all. Commentator John Carroll also many years ago made a comment, which several subsequent commentators have seconded, which is that this inner and outer circle imagery also call together a big picture philosophical pattern of the canticle, which is that knowledge of God at the inner circle moves the outer circle, which is love.
I need a recap.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. Okay, so what we have in this introduction on the literal sense is heaven's circles seen from Dante the protagonist. And these circles, these concentric circles, appear to him like a millstone. Then he uses these figures to describe it. The first one is that the inside is like the voice and the outside is an echo, such as in the story of Narcissus and Echo. Also, the inner is a rainbow being reflected to an outer rainbow. These rainbows both recall to us the story of Noah and God's promise. Additionally, there's this idea that the inside is the knowledge of God, the outer is the love, and that this is a pattern that is repeated over and over again through Paradiso. Additionally, we have this literary and you could almost say almost tangible picture also of Canto 12 coming out of Canto 11. And we have Canto 12 now in our hands.
Okay, thanks.
Are you ready for two more senses to stack on top? Because now, yeah, you're ready?
I'm rhymed and ready.
Okay, good. Because so far we've just looked at these sort of figurative pictures, these allusions, and these methods for describing the millstone. But now on top of this, we have a moral layer. Do you remember what a chiasmus is?
Yeah. Do you want me to draw it for you?
Sure.
That is a chiasmus, and it comes from the Greek letter chi.
Yes, that's wonderful. Okay, with all of Dante's talk of echoes and reflections, all of this is setting us up for the grand rhetorical figure of this canto, which is the chiasmus. And of course, the chiasmus is significant on several layers. First, what's actually happening is that you have a reversal of an inversion of two theological schools, the Dominican and the Franciscan. And in Canto 11, we have a Dominican eulogizing a Franciscan. And in Canto 12, we have a Franciscan eulogizing a Dominican. And if we continue on and look and remember to look at the different figurative imagery that Dante gave us, these two chapters are essentially an echo of each other and a reflection of each other. And one is born from the other, like in this Back to the Holy Millstone. But additionally, more than just a clever structuring device, I believe there's a moral application in this. First, though, let me read a passage in Italian from verse 31 of this canto. Tell me how many times you hear the word altro, okay? E cominciò. L'amor che mi fa bella mi tragge a ragionar dell'altro duca, per cui del mio si ben ci si favella, degno è che dove un l'altro si induca.
Twice.
Yes, of course, twice. Dante's use of the word altro, or other, twice seems to be yet another reflection, right? Or another echo of how this entire canto is set up on a system of duality, beginning with the two circles of the millstone. Again, we see this appearance of the dual in terms of the relationship between the self and the other. The chiasmus, of course, is embodied by St. Tommaso in Canto 11, eulogizing the other, namely the Franciscan school and St. Francis. And in Canto 12, St. Bonaventura eulogizing the founder of the other school, namely the Dominicans and St. Dominic.
Mom, this makes me think of a Bible verse that St. Paul writes to Philippians. I'll read it. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Philippians 2:3-4.
That's excellent. I think that's a wonderful reference, Ruth, and I think you're onto something. Coincidentally, I heard the word other used twice in your passage as well. That was a great reference. And I think that helps us to understand the moral takeaway that Dante wants us to see, which I believe is that in Dante's heaven, his souls are not focused on their own achievements, but rather moved by the knowledge of God, which leads to love and thus humility. They're focused on exalting the other.
Does this mean that in heaven I'll be talking about how awesome my sister is instead of boasting about how awesome I am?
Yes, I do think this is Dante's idea.
Wait, what about the garland of roses?
You're right. There's more to this passage that we haven't talked about. And there's one sense left, the anagogical or eschatological sense. Do you know what these words mean?
Related to end times?
Yes, you got it. In verse 19, Dante writes, Così di quelle sempiterne rose, volte si cercano le due ghirlande, e sì l'estrema alla intima rispose. Would you like to read the English?
Uh-huh. As the two garlands of those sempiternal roses turned about us, the outer replied to the inner.
In this verse, Dante reveals to the reader that the holy millstone, with its inner and outer circle, is actually a circle of eternal souls, turning and rotating around Dante and Beatrice, fashioned as layers of an ethereal rose.
Wow, this metaphor lasagna is getting really deep.
Yes, this deepens it considerably because now we realize we see all of the layers coming together. We realize that the voice to echo, the dual rainbow, the knowledge of God to love, the transition from Canto 11 to Canto 12, the reference to Noah and the chiasmus to come is also a rotating, multi-layered flower comprised of heavenly spirits. And this isn't just another allegorical layer. This is adding to the super spiritual end times concept. This is what Dante imagined existence in heaven to be like for the souls that inhabit it.
Mom, does everybody of Dante have so many layers? It's an awful lot to chew on.
Yes, it is. Do you want to know the trick to remembering all these layers? There's also a scandal involved in it.
How could I pass that up?
Okay, you study Latin, so you should be able to understand this little song. It goes like this. Lettera gesta docet, quid credas allegoria, moralis quid agas, quotendas anagogia.
Something about the letter, allegory, morality, and something else?
That's good. The letter speaks of deeds, allegory to faith, the moral how to act, and anagogy our destiny. This was the way in which the medievals understood how the scripture was to be interpreted, that every passage of God's was significant and had meaning in the literal, historical, allegorical, moral, and eschatological sense.
Where's the scandal in this?
Well, the scandal is that Dante, in a letter that many scholars believed he wrote to his patron Con Grande, expressed that he wanted his divine comedy to be interpreted according to this fourfold theological allegory. And this was the way scholars reserved for interpreting only the Holy Bible, not a fiction of man's invention.
So Dante wanted readers to read his book like they read the Bible? Was he presuming to be writing like God?
Yes, you've nailed the scandal on the head. Nonetheless, several scholars still debate that Dante actually wrote the letter. Among the most well-known scholars of our time, however, Teodolinda Barolini and Robert Hollander say that, quote, whether or not Dante wrote this document, whoever wrote it only makes explicit what had already been accomplished in this poem.
So even if Dante didn't write the letter, his Divine Comedy appears to be written according to fourfold allegory anyway?
Well, it does seem like that at times. Whether or not he penned the letter, whether or not he had such arrogant or even heretical intentions, let's see if knowing the four senses helps to make sense of this passage. Why don't we do a little exercise? How about you call out the sense, see if you can remember them, and I'll see if it fits.
The literal historical.
Get that Dante and Beatrice are moving upwards through these concentric circles.
The allegorical.
Okay, now this one has many layers. First, there's the pagan story of Echo and Narcissus, which makes us see that the inner circle is like the voice and the outer is echo. Then there's a philosophical relationship between knowledge of God on the inner circle and love on the outer. Then there's this literary relationship between Canto 11 as the inner and Canto 12 as the outer. Then there's this cosmological relationship seen by the rainbow on the inner and its reflection on the outer. And then there's the biblical allusion to Noah. So there's really 5 folds or 5 layers inside of just this allegorical or figurative layer.
Then there's the moral sense.
Yes. And I believe this is expressed and reflected over the chiasmus, in which the Dominican, St. Thomas, sings the praises of Francis, and the Franciscan, Bonaventura, sings the praises of Dominic. They're focused on the merits of the other and not on boasting in the self.
Then, lastly, the eschatological or end-time sense.
The garland of roses, the souls that inhabit paradise, they make up the inner and outer circles. They are the fabric or the petals of the circles. Instead of pointing to things on earth, they make us think of our future in heaven. Great, I think we did it. Now let's talk briefly about Saint Bonaventura, who is the main speaker in this canto, since, after all, we happen to live right near the Bonaventura mission in Ventura, California. Ruth, can you tell us a little bit about who Bonaventura was?
Sure. Bonaventura was born in Italy. As a child, it appears that he had a near-death experience, and after being prayed for by St. Francis, he was healed. After that, he commits his life to entering the Franciscan order.
Yes, and along the way, he also gets very well educated in the process and studies alongside St. Tommaso even at one point, the great scholastic theologian. Do you know who Dominic was?
The way the story goes, Dominic's mother was barren.
Oh, kind of like Hannah in the Bible. Do you remember the story of Hannah?
Yeah, and like Hannah, she goes to pray. While she's there, she dreams that a dog jumps from her womb, carrying a flaming torch and sets the earth on fire.
And it's said that just having Dominic in her womb made Dominic's mom a prophet. This reminds me of...
That reminds me of John the Baptist. When he was in Elizabeth's womb, the baby kicked when he saw Mary with Jesus in her womb.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Additionally, there's something kind of cool about Dominic's name. His name comes from a play on the Latin words dominis and canis.
God and dog. How clever.
And just to add one last layer to all of this, here we are today, precisely 700 years after the death of Dante in 1321. And according to some sources, precisely 800 years after the death of Dominic in 1221, and coincidentally in precisely 800 years after the birth of Bonaventura, also in 1221, at the mission in Ventura, named after Bonaventura. And we're reading about how Dante has Bonaventura eulogize St. Dominic in Canto 12 of Paradiso.
Oh boy, my brain is really packed full of metaphor lasagna now.
What do you think about taking a break to celebrate?
Sounds great. Uno, due, tre.
Buon anniversario, Dante, Dominic. Buon compleanno, Bonaventura. 1, 2, 3.
Happy anniversary year, Dante and Dominic. Happy birthday year, Bonaventure. Bye. Thanks for watching.